Hello, everyone. I'm Jamie Marasotis, President and CEO of Lumina Foundation. Lumina is a private foundation in the U.S. committed to racial equity and making opportunities for learning beyond high school available to all. I'm also the author of a recent book called Human Work in the Age of Smart Machines. Smart machines are truly amazing. They can perform work that emphasizes speed, repetition, or patterns in ways that exceed human capacity. But machines have limitations as well. Machines can't understand subtlety, nuance, how people react in unpredictable ways. The more interaction with humans, the less likely it can be done by machines. There's a lot to think about as we move towards this human work ecosystem. And that brings us to today's panel topic, provocatively titled, Will Robots Displace Workers of Color? I'm delighted to be joined by three distinguished experts who will help us explore this question from a variety of angles. Vilas Dar, president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, which is focused on AI for good and building an equitable, sustainable, and thriving future for all. Cecilia Munoz of New America, a DC-based organization dedicated to renewing the promise of America. Dr. Munoz also recently completed a tour of duty running domestic and economic policy for the Biden-Harris transition. Spencer Overton, president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, often called America's Black Think Tank, a forum of leading experts and scholars who promote ideas that advance Black communities. Before we start, we'd like to share a brief video produced by our partners at Working Nation. America stands at a pivotal moment. Even before COVID battered the workforce, rapidly changing technology has disrupted the way we work, creating an enormous increase in the demand for evolving skills across almost all occupations. Millions of jobs for people with a high school education or less have disappeared and will never come back. Meanwhile, jobs requiring some college or an associate degree have grown, and those requiring a bachelor's degree have exploded. At the same time, Black Lives Matter has exposed the structural racism that continues to plague our country. The pandemic underscores the inequities. People of color are suffering higher death rates, in part because they're more likely to work in occupations classified as essential, and they also have been disproportionately affected by the economic and unemployment crisis. The questions are, will robots take the jobs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color? And how can we ensure this doesn't happen by providing skills and opportunities that ensure that everyone is part of the post-pandemic recovery? In recent years, the dominant narrative about the so-called future of work has been one of massive job loss, fueled by rapid advances in artificial intelligence. At the same time, we know that technology in the past has often created more jobs than it's displaced. So my question for the panel is, how do you see the ongoing advance of technology in the current era, propelled by AI, playing out when it comes to work? Vilas, would you like to start us off?
Let me start with a bit of a provocative statement. I will tell you that I am enthusiastic, impatient. I cannot wait until AI begins to displace some of the traditional jobs that BIPOC workers, immigrant workers, and the economically disadvantaged in this country have held. What I mean by that is those jobs, the jobs that these communities have come forward in service of, have traditionally been those that are the highest risk, the most insecure, the most dangerous: mining, industrial work, being at the front line of our COVID response. And these populations have stood up to really be heroes at times of need and to take those jobs over. But I don't want to be a part of an American future where these people have to face the same choice that generations of Americans have had to make, to risk their health, their welfare, their well-being in pursuit of economic opportunity.
Cecilia, the changes that I think we're talking about threaten many American workers, and as we've been vividly reminded during the pandemic, that's especially true for workers of color. So what's behind this, and why is it so connected to our shared well-being going forward?
Well, thank you so much, Jamie. I'm really I'm grateful that we're raising this topic at this particular moment, because the crisis that we are still living through has really exposed a lot about the ways in which we have failed each other as a society. And just as you just heard, it gives us the possibility of having a different kind of conversation about what we value. We've learned, for example, that we rely on the hard work of sectors that are overwhelmingly represented by people of color in the workforce. that we have depended on for our very survival during this pandemic. The people who harvest the food that we eat, the people who transport it, the people, who staff the grocery stores where we purchase it or where we order it from. A lot has been said about essential workers, and I think we have developed a new kind of understanding of how much we depend on them. But we've also found that of the workers that the government classified as essential during the pandemic, those fields are overwhelmingly populated by people of color, and about 40% of them don't earn a living wage, right? So we have to say that on the one hand, we've learned that these are positions that we depend on, workers that we depend on, and we've also learned that we don't compensate that work in a way that allows people a sustainable living. And that suggests a conversation about what we value, what we're prepared to pay for. Some of these occupations are things which are unlikely to be automated. Caregivers, for example, early education teachers in general. And so it really, hopefully, will start a conversation about what we value and what needs to happen to make sure that we compensate the workers that we rely on for our very well-being. And hopefully that can connect to this conversation about automation and what that potentially means for the workforce. As you say, some occupations are going to be automated. And I think I agree that for many reasons, there's good reason to look forward to that day. But the conversation about what happens to work has to be attached to a conversation about workers and how we value them and how we show up with respect to wages, with respect to other supports that workers need in order to have a sustainable life.
It's extremely important. I really appreciate that point. Thank you, Cecilia. So Spencer, your research at the Joint Center focuses on an array of issues concerning the persistent and evolving barriers to full freedom for Black Americans. And you've recently done some really compelling work on Black workers in the rural South, a topic that I think hasn't received nearly enough national attention. So how are advances in technology affecting these workers, and do you see AI magnifying those trends?
We looked at 156 counties that are at least 35% Black, designated as rural by the USDA. In those areas, we found that 63% of Black folks had a high school diploma or less, which isn't really what's needed in terms of competing in today's economy. 52% of Black children are in poverty. Unemployment is about 3 times as high as the national average in those places. And in the Black rural South, we found that over half of the jobs that exist are at high risk to automation, are in industries at high risk to automation, compared to only about a third nationwide. That's manufacturing, retail, food services. But something that's unique about the Black rural South, in addition to the automation piece, is the negative job growth. We see job growth in places like Seattle or Reno, but in the Black rural South, we see significant job loss. It's predicted it'll be negative 9% in terms of job growth between now and 2030. So even if people do get skills, are there jobs for them? So there are a variety of issues. Yes, we've got to get people skills, but the question here is how do we also get them jobs? We see this phenomenon in other places as well, like Appalachia, the industrial Midwest, the Mississippi River Delta area from Illinois down to Louisiana, where you've got these large concentrations of people and fewer jobs because the economy has moved to another place. So question here is, how do we deal with this phenomena as a nation?
You know, I began my narration of the video by calling this a pivotal moment for our country. And even as we grapple with these long-term trends, I think we face a number of crises simultaneously. COVID-19, the economy, racial inequity and injustice, climate change, and a crisis, I think, of the very foundations of our democracy. So are there threads that tie these together? Can we grapple with long-term economic forces without solving our more immediate existential crises first? Maybe let me ask Cecilia to start with that one first.
It's not a small question. I think as we have learned, as I think this crisis has taught us, the multiple crises that you point out, is that you can't really address these things in silos. And in a fundamental way, they come back to what we value as a country, as a society, as a people, right? So the challenges of what's happening with the workforce, the challenges of addressing the pandemic, making sure that we're able to stay safe and keep each other safe as Americans, the challenges of racial equity and racial injustice, those are all related. They are all interconnected. And so we're really at a moment of reckoning. And it has to do with both what our public policy set out to do, but also with just what we as citizens, what we as participants in this democracy set as a direction to go together. And frankly, whether or not we decide to set a direction to go together, the sort of divisions that we're confronting, the challenges in particular of equity, especially racial equity, at least what that suggests to me is that we can't decide that issue is in some silo somewhere that somebody else is going to think about. It has to be something that we all think about, that we all understand our responsibility to address. And that we can't solve our problems around the pandemic where there have been such huge disparities unless we're looking at questions of equity. We are not going to solve the challenge of what happens with work in the United States and globally if we are not also looking at the questions of equity and making sure that we are striving to become a society where there is some level of equity and access to opportunity, where ultimately we all have a stake in that. That's not somebody else's problem. That is our collective challenge as a country.
I think it's a really important point. And Vilas, I'd love to hear your cut on, Cecilia's point about this moment of reckoning and the issue of, can we address these big issues without addressing these existential crises, or can we do them at the same time? And what's the role of AI and automation in that process?
This is a moment for us to make decisions, and the us requires definition. These are shared decisions that reflect a shared human future. If we take a diffuse phenomenon of technology encroaching on work, and we really identify where that's happening, I think it's pretty easy to begin to hone in on technology developers and the owners of capital who are deploying these technologies inside of their institutions. What's missing in that context is the voice of the rural Black community, of migrants and the economically disadvantaged, of people across the country who are participating, but maybe not necessarily part of the conversation on the decisions we will make about what comes next.
Spencer, I think let's go back to you here for a second, because again, you made this point earlier. This seems like a big challenge for our current education and training systems, not to mention the way people work. So how will these systems need to change to better prepare people for what we know is coming?
Yeah, and you talk about what we know is coming, and we knew it was coming, but COVID has accelerated it. When we talk about the shift to online sales, when we talk about not having cashiers at a checkout, or the use of autonomous robots, digital surveillance, the significance of digital skills, just a lot of big changes that have been really kind of driven by COVID. And what's really important here, though, is to focus on not having our minds that we're trying to fix some broken people of color, right? We're not fixing broken people. We're fixing broken systems here. And when you talk about issues like climate change and the pandemic and all of this and racial inequality, many of these problems stem from earlier changes in the economy where folks took advantage of benefits in terms of, obviously cotton and slavery. When we talk about the Industrial Revolution and greenhouse gas that came from it. And we're now dealing with the costs of those things. So the question here now in this moment is, how do we avoid shifting the costs of innovation today to communities who are least situated to bear that cost? Indeed, how do we ensure that they benefit from innovation, and maybe even how do we ensure that they disproportionately benefit? And to do that, we need to design systems to include them. A number of public policies we've had in the past, like the GI Bill, which supposedly lifted all boats, or the Paycheck Protection Plan program, which was extended to small businesses in the wake of the pandemic, really did not help many in communities of color. In many ways, they exacerbated racial disparities because they weren't designed to deal with the challenges that are unique in communities of color.
Vilas, you're an entrepreneur and a technologist and a philanthropy leader. And Cecilia, you're a national policy leader, someone who has a deep understanding of philanthropy and broader social change. I'd love to hear, maybe first from you, Vilas, how you think higher education needs to change to help these issues as one part of that overall set of systems that Spencer was talking about.
Yeah, I think about systems, and I think we have to have multiple approaches. I always come at them first from the perspective of the individual, the one who is facing a system that is so much larger than themselves and they have to engage with it. When it comes to education, I think that we have to really re-examine our model of four-year colleges as being the path to a technology-enabled career. We have to really re-examine whether there are jobs being created in a digital economy that require a totally different path, whether through micro-credentialing or using an incredible asset we have here in the United States of the two-year community colleges. How do we refocus our ability to share knowledge and equip workers to engage in a digital economy without forcing them to take on a financial burden that then creates a path dependency for their entire career?
Cecilia, what are your thoughts on this?
We too frequently think of these challenges as something which is being done to communities of color. In this case, because we're talking about automation and AI, done to people of color by, white guys in the Silicon Valley. And that's kind of the paradigm in which we too frequently have this conversation. And we are not having a conversation about how can, in fact, these communities of color be the agents of change who are driving these technologies forward and be at the table to make sure that not just that this isn't that we don't do bad things, that we don't create harms that are unintended through the use of these technologies, but that we're actually leveraging innovation in the service of equity, right? So instead of framing the conversation as this stuff is happening and it could be really bad to vulnerable communities who kind of get screwed every time something changes, what if we position the conversation and position the communities themselves as drivers of change? And so I'm a public policymaker, we of course need to have the policy conversation about how to mitigate harms, but the conversation I have the most urgency about is how to make sure that the folks whose lives are going to be affected are actually the people driving the conversation and driving the technology itself. Just as we need to prevent the harms that could be caused by these technological changes, we should be leveraging innovation to make the changes that we need. I think we should be thinking of it also in an affirmative way. How can we leverage what's changing to address these systemic problems that you just heard outlined? That's how we should be thinking about it.
Yeah, I love this idea, and I love the idea that you can leverage innovation with the people who need to be at the center of these conversations as critical to this. I just think it's really important. And Spencer, I think back to your point earlier. I think there's a broader conversation here about government in general, at the federal level, at the state level, and the local level. I think in terms of working towards solutions. So from your view, how do governments at all levels effectively partner with the private sector in some of this conversation that Cecilia and Vilas were just talking about?
Right. Well, Jamie, I think it's got to be a partnership. The private sector, they're not always the incentives to ensure that everyone has skills. I mean, if I run a company, I don't know that I want to basically train your employees through, investing a lot in training, and then someone leaves and they go to work for my competitor here. So there are interesting incentives that individual companies have, and then sometimes states and localities have some of those incentives. The federal government can't do it all either, though. I mean, they don't always know the skills that private industry needs. The federal government doesn't always appreciate that, economies are local. You can't just have a one size fits all with regard to skill attainment. So there's got to be this role of the federal government in terms of supporting localities, supporting the private sector. I think the big thing, though, has got to be, as a national goal, we've got to have just collectively a well-trained, a highly skilled workforce that is credentialed, right? This is not a commodity that's limited to one company or one locality. It's more like, national defense or the containment of COVID. This is a national goal that benefits us all. In the past world, a lot of economic growth in the United States has come from trying to benefit from low wage or no wage labor, whether that's slavery, whether that is Jim Crow that, trapped folks into, low wage sharecropping, or whether it is the Bracero programs here that brought in agricultural workers here. Again, we're not going to win just through low wages. And many of those programs had significant racial overtones that are obvious.
Why is it so important that we address these changes to work? In other words, what are the consequences if we fail to address them with the urgency that I think that they demand?
I mean, we all understand sort of the importance of work for economic security, right? That's a given. Part of the conversation that we need to be having about the future of work in the United States also has to do with purpose. And that is, again, going back to what is it that we value? What is it that we're prepared to pay for to make sure that people can live a sustainable life? But what is our common sense of direction? And work is actually a really big part of that. And the notion that purpose is part of this conversation. It is tremendously important. That's not kind of a luxurious element of the debate, which we get to after we address the nuts and bolts of public policy or of economic questions. The challenges that we're facing now, and in some ways the pandemic has thrown this into high relief as well, because so many people are out of work, so many people are working under very different circumstances than they're used to, has thrown into high relief this notion of work is also what connects people to each other, what connects us to our society, what connects us to our sense of purpose in the world. And we can't lose that element of the conversation. It's tremendously, tremendously important to being a healthy society, and one that, as we aspire to be a society that leads the world in a constructive way. New America did a study with low-wage workers. I'll use the example of grocery workers that we interviewed about the potential impacts of automation. And while these are folks who potentially stand to lose their jobs as a result of the creation of this technology, what they were really interested in was being consulted on how the technology was going to be designed, because they know these jobs and they know what efficiencies can be built through technology that can make for a better outcome, for a better result. And they were actually excited about what was possible because they could see ways in which you could use technology to make things better in the workplace. And so that's also a way to think about meaning that connects the workers themselves to the overall objectives of the place where they work. And also puts them more in the driver's seat about how technology gets leveraged. And so there are kind of multiple dimensions to this question of meaning and purpose that require us to remember the humanity of the workers that we're talking about. And that means policymakers need to remember that, but also employers need to remember that. Technology are not just tools to be deployed in the service of profits any more than people are tools to be deployed in the service of profits. There are ways to do this which acknowledge our humanity and make us a stronger society as well as a stronger workforce.
What an energizing conversation. Vilas Dar, Cecilia Munoz, Spencer Overton, thank you very much for being here. This has just been fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you all.